Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining. Afternoon, everyone. We'll just give it a minute to allow everybody to join. So now is your chance to go grab a drink, go get your lunch, do what you need to do. That's absolutely fine before we get started. Just so you're all aware, this session is being recorded. And we will send a follow-up email after the session with the slides and with the recording as well. Great. Okay, we're a few minutes in, so I think I'll get started and then people can just filter in as and when. Well, hello, everybody. Thank you so much for joining this webinar, this lunch and learn on Introduction to Climate Change and Carbon, as it says on the screen, which hopefully you can all see okay, and hopefully you can all hear me clearly. Do let me know on the chat if there are ever any issues with the sound or the screen or anything like that. But as it says on the screen, my name is Hattie Webb. I'm a consultant at Action Sustainability. And my background is in net zero, carbon, and sustainability strategy as well. So I end up running quite a few of these sessions on carbon and climate change. And I hope you find it interesting. I hope you learn a lot. For those of you that don't know, Action Sustainability is essentially the parent company of the Supply Chain Sustainability School. And the Supply Chain Sustainability School is an online free platform for all sustainability learning resources. So if you haven't used it before, do head on over there and make most of all the free resources. We have loads of resources relating to carbon and climate change as well. So you'll notice that some of the content that I use throughout this session is also linked in with the school as well, because essentially our team of consultants feed in all of our expertise and knowledge into the school as well. But Action Sustainability is a consultancy. So we're a team of consultants going across all areas of sustainability. Like I said, I specialize in carbon and strategy, but we also have consultants relating to sustainable procurement, to modern slavery, to social value as well. So, really covering all of those different areas of sustainability. For this session, though, we're going to be talking about carbon and climate change and what we can do to actually reduce carbon emissions. And then I'll also be talking a little bit more about carbon footprinting as well. Before we get started, we're going to be using something called Mentimeter. So if you can just get set up on here now, that would be great. Hopefully you can see the instructions on my screen. So you can either scan the QR code using your phone or just type in menti.com and enter the code there. I'll also put it on the chat as well. If anyone joins a bit late, you can still see it. Great. So I'll give you a few minutes to get set up on Menti. Should be blank, but you can just click the little thumbs up emoji once you're there. And the first question is just something simple to get us into this carbon climate change mindset. What words come to mind when you think of climate change and carbon? And a word cloud will start appearing here. This is anonymous, by the way, and of course, there's no right or wrong answer. Wow, interesting word. Extractivism. Good word. Natural disasters, emissions, global warming, future. Challenging. Yep, thank you for the honesty there. What else is here? Pollution, energy, weather, environment. Yeah, warming, of course. Vehicles. Yeah, costly. Drought, worrying. Yeah, of course. Opportunities. That's a very positive spin on it. I like that. Net zero, someone said, and flooding, progression, reduction. Decarbonisation, habitat loss, challenges, another challenger, one again. What else has come in? Future, someone said. Gets harder and harder for me to read as they start kind of flipping on different sides, but this is great. I mean, keep them coming. And of course, this is just to, well, check that Menti works for starters, which it looks like it is, which is great, but also just to get us in this climate change and carbon mindset. And of course, it's a huge topic and it can mean different things to different people. It can also spark a variety of different emotions. For a lot of us, when we start talking about this, it's, oh, this is a challenge, there's a lot to do, which, is very valid. So I think it's interesting just to see what this topic brings up, how broad it is, and that actually it can be quite complex because there's a lot to it. So, hopefully, this session will help debunk some of the words that are out there, some of the terminology and the jargon, and help just bring a little bit more clarity and hopefully help you feel a little bit more at ease about some of the challenges that are ahead, as some of you have put here. It is potentially challenging. Great. I'm just going to go back to my slides. Here we go. Cool. So let's do an introduction to climate change. I appreciate that you are all coming into this with very different levels of knowledge when it comes to this topic. So it's important that we start with the basics. So climate change is caused by a phenomenon called the greenhouse gas effect. This is very much a natural phenomenon, but human activities are accelerating this process. So we're pumping more and more greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, making this blanket that is wrapped around the earth thicker, which is trapping more heat. So the earth is now 1.1 degrees warmer than pre-industrial levels. And there are a series or a list of different greenhouse gases that cause climate change. Can actually some of you guess on the chat what these greenhouse gases are? Some of them are more obvious than others. Methane, yeah. There's an even more obvious one as well. CO2, of course. Got the top two. Yep, nitrous oxide, perfluorocarbon as well. Great. I've just shown the whole list now, but great guesses. Yeah, we have nitrous oxide, sulfur hexafluoride, hydrofluorocarbons, perfluorocarbons, and nitrogen trifluoride as well. So methane is mainly released through agriculture through digestion. That's why I've got the picture of the cow there. Nitrous oxide is most commonly found in pressurized metal canisters. Why I've got the whippy cream. Sulfur hexafluoride is mainly found in electrical insulation, and hydrofluorocarbons are normally liquids used in aircon equipment. So in the UK, our breakdown is at 79% comes from CO2, 13% from methane, 5% from nitrous oxide, and 3% from fluorocarbons. And this is in line with the Kyoto Protocol, what they call the basket of six greenhouse gases. But it's important when we're talking about greenhouse gases to note that they don't all have the same impact. So some have a very high global warming potential. So methane, for example, has a global warming potential of 28, which means it's 28 times stronger than carbon dioxide. So emitting 1 kilogram of methane is the same as 28 kilograms of CO2. And don't worry, you don't need to know, or you won't need to know any of these numbers off by heart, but it's just important for you to know the different impacts between different gases. So, how have these greenhouse gases changed over time? Well, this graph shows the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere over the last 800,000 years. So, the y axis is parts per million, and the x axis is dates through time. And up until humans arrived, there were very regular fluctuations. So when it's higher, the temperature is warmer, and when it's lower, it might have been ice ages, for example. But on the far right hand side, you can start to see how humans have impacted this process. So after the Industrial Revolution, when we started burning coal and then oil and gas, you can see that steep increase. So we're now at 420 parts per million of CO2 in the atmosphere, and it's still increasing. And of course, this is having dramatic impacts across the world. And you can see more closely here the impact of agricultural civilization and the Industrial Revolution. Through the Holocene period, you can see that was fairly stable. And then there's been that sharp increase in more recent years. And then over the last 200 years, it's clear that this rise in temperature is directly linked to CO2 levels in the atmosphere. So, in other words, it's human induced, or you might have heard it as anthropogenic emissions. It just means human caused emissions. And this is equated to a 1.1-degree warming since pre industrial levels. And of course, this has led to devastating impacts across the world. You'll see here forest fires in Australia, in Greece, hurricanes in the Caribbean, shrinking glaciers. In more recent times, we've heard of hurricanes in the US, also severe flooding in Spain and Valencia very recently. Of course, in the UK, we have experienced flash flooding and also extreme heat waves. And this is because climate change is a multiplier, and it takes existing patterns and it makes it more extreme. And all of this impact can actually get more and more severe over time. So we'll reach certain tipping points. And an example of this is rainforests. So rainforests will turn to savanna if there isn't enough rain, and then it will be hard to kind of reverse the impacts of that. So, who's doing the emitting when we're looking at this from a global perspective? Well, this graph shows the countries that are emitting the most. So, you can see that China emits 28% of global emissions, then the US, then India, then Russia. UK at 18th on the list, so we emit 1% of global emissions, and Ireland all the way down in 73rd place, emitting 0.1%. But of course, when we're looking at global data, we shouldn't just look at it like this. We can also look at it in relation to a country's population or per person. So we take into account how many inhabitants are in each country. So in this way, USA are actually a bigger polluter than China. And you can see now the UK are fifth place. But actually, can you guess on the chat which country has the biggest per capita emissions? Because it's not the US. Which country in the world do you think has the biggest per capita emissions? And it's not another country on the screen here, it's a different country. Oh, interesting. It's not Vatican City. Any other guesses? It's close with Qatar. I was gonna say, um, oh no, sorry, it is Qatar. It is Qatar. I was looking at something else then. It is Qatar. Good guess. Wow. I think this is the first one of these I've done where someone has guessed the right answer. So, well done to you. He said Qatar. I think that's why I was shocked that it came up because it hasn't happened before. So well done. It is Qatar. They have the highest per capita emissions in the world at 38 tons of CO2 per person. So it's almost double that of the US. And this is because Qatar is an oil exporter. It's their main export, which means, which of course is very carbon intensive. And of course, it's a very small country. So they have a population of less than 30 million people. We can also look at this in relation to a kind of a given, rather than looking at it in a given year, we can look at historical emissions. So you can see that if we look at historical emissions or emissions over time, USA are now in the first place, then the EU collectively, then China, then Russia, and then UK. So you can see that the list kind of changes depending on how we look at this data, and it's really, really important to bear in mind that we have a collective kind of global responsibility. It's very easy to put emissions or responsibility on another country, the way that they calculate these are called kind of territorial emissions. So, of course, you're not taking into account emissions from the supply chain when you're saying, the UK's emissions, for example. You're not taking into account all of the demand that the UK bring from countries like China. So, it's something definitely to bear in mind when we're looking at this data. And on that note, we really need to bear in mind something called climate inequality. So this graph shows that the richest 10% contribute 50% of global emissions, whereas the poorest 50% only emit 10% of emissions. But of course, the poorest people are the most vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. So more than 21 million people around the world have had to leave their homes due to natural disasters as a direct result of climate change. And of course, this number is increasing quickly. So this is called climate inequality. And COP29 is going on at the moment in Azerbaijan, in Baku. And this will be, I'm sure, a topic of conversation going forward throughout the week on actually, where does the responsibility lie? Reparations, how do we in the Western world make up for all of our historical emissions and the impact that, the Industrial Revolution, for example, has had? We can also look at emissions from a sector point of view. So you can see the breakdown here. Energy makes up 73% of emissions, and that's energy from buildings, energy from transport, energy use in industry. A fairly big chunk, 18%, is from agriculture, forestry, and land use as well. And then we also have a breakdown of industry and emissions from waste. So this also helps, to think about the impact that the industry that you're in can have on collective, national efforts, also global efforts as well. If we're in the construction industry or the built environment industry, actually, how can what we learn in terms of emissions cuts and reductions be transferred over to the US, for example? And, um, how can we look at this from kind of a global industry lens as well, the wider impact that we have? And the construction built environment industry has a huge opportunity when it comes to cutting emissions. Someone did say opportunity at the beginning there, and I like that positivity. So, linking that in with the opportunity that you have within your industry, whatever industry that might be. Okay, so a little bit about how governments have kind of taken action. Obviously, we know that it's the right thing to do, is to reduce emissions. What has the government, the global world, been doing about this? Well, I've already mentioned COP. Which is taking place at the moment. It finishes on the 22nd in Azerbaijan. But if we rewind a little bit to the Kyoto Protocol, this took place in 1997, and it was kind of the first time that global efforts or commitments were made when it came to climate change. And this is when the basket of 6 greenhouse gases were defined. The Kyoto Protocol was then superseded by the Paris Agreement, which entered into force in 2016. And then that has kind of continued with these COP conferences, or it's called COP stands for Conference of the Parties, and they take place on a yearly basis. You might have remembered, or you might remember COP26, which took place in Glasgow. I think it's because it was in the UK. It's kind of the most well-known one, or the one that people often remember. But you can see that, yeah, this year we're at COP29. From a UK perspective, what have we done? Well, we have the UK Climate Change Act, which means that we have a net zero target of making 100% reduction by 2050. That's what net zero means. You can see the graph on the right, the reductions we've already made, and then the reductions we still have to make in order to get all the way down to zero by 2050. Scotland have a slightly earlier target of 2045. Wales and Ireland both have 2050 targets. And then we did have a new intermediate target of reducing our emissions by 78% by 2035. But as of hot off the press, I think as of maybe Monday, the UK government have announced its increased national emissions reduction target to achieve an 81% reduction by 2035. And the UK is actually currently on track with their reduction targets, having already achieved a 49.5% reduction from our 1990 baseline. And of course, this is due to fully phasing out coal from our energy mix, and with strong ambition to further roll out renewables, electrify our transport system and general industrial carbonisation. I do think, although is an ambitious target, it is achievable as well if we stick to our goals and aims over the next few years. And a lot of people are talking about the next 10 years very much being the kind of decade of action, although 2050 is a long way off. And often we can think, that's ages away. Who knows where we'll be then? That's tomorrow's problem. Actually, in order to be able to reach 2050, that 2050 target, and ensure that we're on line with the Paris Agreement, not going over that 1.5 degrees of warming since pre-industrial levels, we do need to make sure that we hit those targets in the next 10 years. 80% by 2035, hugely ambitious. And that's not long away. So important thing to bear in mind with those intermediate targets. I can just see someone said on the chat about sending the recording. Yeah, don't worry, we'll be sending that around afterwards. This is also a really useful graph. This is from the scientists from the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And they came up with this graph which represents global emissions and the different possible pathways and outcomes. So that orange part there is if we carried on as usual with our current policies, we'd see a world that is 3 degrees warmer, leading to severe effects in the world. That bluish line there is if we met pledges and targets, we'd be kind of 2.4 degrees warmer since pre-industrial levels, still leading to devastating impacts. What we need is to go further, and we need to limit warming to 1.5 degrees at the bottom. I think often when we're talking about these 2 degrees, 1.5 degrees pathways, actually it doesn't seem like a lot. It's only a 0.5 degree difference, but actually it makes a huge difference. And I think it'd be great if you could all head back on over to Menti, because I've got a few questions that just help kind of hit this point, bring this point home. That's the saying. And kind of bring this point to life a little bit more. So I've got 3 questions here to help us think about the difference between a 1.5 degree and a 2 degree pathway. So the first question, the global population exposed to extreme heat on a 1.5 degree pathway would be 14%. What would it be on a 2 degree pathway? Great, I can see some responses coming in. Hopefully you're all okay with getting onto Menti. Do let us know on the chat if you're having issues with it. Okay, a bit of a mixed response here. No one went for 17%. Okay, I'll do a bit of a countdown to give those of you that haven't voted a chance to vote. 3, 2, 1. So the correct answer is 37%. So you can see how that's, over, double, and you can see the big difference that will make from a 1.5 degree to a 2 degree pathway. Next question, the number of ice-free summers would be at least 1 every 100 years on a 1.5 degree pathway. What would it be on a 2 degree pathway? 1 in 10, 1 in 20, or 1 in 75? Great, a few of you have said 1 in 20. Couple have said 1 in 10. Okay, I'll show the answer. 3, 2, 1. It is in fact 1 in 10. So again, significant difference that it will make if we go from a 1.5-degree pathway to a 2-degree pathway. Final question, coral reefs will decline by at least 70% on a 1.5-degree pathway. How much will they decline on a 2-degree pathway? 80%, 89%, or 99%? Okay, three, two, oh, someone's stuck in there. Three, two, one. Okay, it's 99%. So well done to the nine of you that got that right. And of course, when we're looking at some of these figures and stats and differences, it can seem a bit doom and gloom, especially when we look at our current targets and pledges and where we're heading towards. But actually, hopefully, it just helps to galvanize that action even more, um, and hopefully leads us towards thinking of those opportunities that come from decarbonizing from a business perspective. Obviously, we know it's just the right thing to do. Those differing stats there really showed that, and showed that we want to avoid as much as possible going to that 2-degree world. But also, there's a whole host of other reasons why it just makes business sense. Of course, compliance is a huge thing now. You might have to report against SECA, for example, streamline energy and carbon reporting. You might have to, for other legislative reasons, include carbon reporting as part of your day to day. But of course, carbon and energy, you may be reporting with ESOS, energy and carbon very, very tightly linked. So, energy security is a big driver, might help you improve your reputation, might help cut costs. Meeting stakeholder client demands a big thing now. Also, might help you win new work and stand out above competitors as well. Maybe you can become a market leader in this space. So hopefully we can, spin this also in a positive way and look at the opportunities that can come from decarbonising. It's only going to be a good thing, and all of these knock-on benefits that come from that. Attracting and retaining talent is also a big one I forgot to mention. Lots of research has shown that employees are more loyal to companies that care about their impact on people and society. Okay, so introductory part done. Now let's have a look at where carbon comes from and how we can reduce it. So, when we're talking about carbon from an organizational perspective or emissions from an organizational perspective, we like to break it down into these three kind of categories or three different buckets. So, first of all, you will have emissions that come from your business. So, these are direct emissions. These are emissions from fuel and energy and company facilities. This would be direct emissions from any vehicles or plant that you own, and any kind of fugitive biological chemical processes as well, any fugitive emissions. You also then have emissions from your suppliers. So these are any purchased goods and services, any capital goods, delivery of those goods, utilities such as electricity, waste, and water also falls into this, in business travel. So these are indirect emissions. And then we have emissions from your clients. So these are emissions from actually using your asset or running the building, any end of life treatment, that sort of thing. So we can apply your value chain to this, looking at the upstream side of it and the downstream side of it. And then we can apply different terminology to this. There's a lot of jargon in this space. So we have operational carbon. Those are those direct emissions, so emissions from using the buildings that you own. You then have embodied carbon. So, embodied carbon is basically all of the carbon used, all of the emissions used and released when you are kind of building the building or making the product. So, that would be any emissions from on site, or any emissions from materials, transport of those materials, that sort of thing. Could also be called capital carbon. And then you have that end user or used carb emissions as well, which just mean client emissions. And a key concept to grasp when we're thinking about policy and strategy more widely when it comes to carbon and responding to climate change is mitigation and adaptation. So, mitigation on the left hand side is all about emitting less in the first place, and adaptation is all about adapting to the impacts of climate change. So a few examples of mitigation are things like renewable energy, sustainable transportation, that sort of thing. Adaptation is kind of more longer term programs, so maybe infrastructure upgrades, health programs, that sort of thing. And you can see that there's this overlap in the middle. So these are mainly nature based solutions like planting trees. They're both a mitigation and an adaptation. And this is because they absorb CO2, so they reduce emissions, but they also support biodiversity, which helps us adapt to climate change. And we just got here a list. Oh, these animations are a bit strange. We've got here a list of just some carbon reduction reduction actions you can think about, which you can refer back to when we send the slides over. Because actually, what I want to highlight here is this carbon and energy hierarchy. And this is how we recommend you go about your carbon reduction solutions and actions. So you need to make your way down this hierarchy. So in the first place, can you actually avoid? So just don't use the energy if you can avoid the need. Obviously, if that isn't an option, can you then look at reducing? So using less by smart design, maybe more efficient equipment, less materials. If that's not an option, can you then switch to low carbon and renewable sources of energy and materials? And only once you've tried those three options, then can you look at things such as carbon removal schemes or offsetting. And this is very much in line with net zero. Net zero is all about reducing emissions as much as possible by at least 90%. And only then, once you've done that, can you look at things like offsetting and carbon removal schemes. And this very much links in with a wider carbon reduction strategy. If you don't have this strategy like this in place, I'd really recommend that you do so that you have that kind of level of structure and process in place. So, in the first instance, you need to have a goal and a scope. So, agree your aims, set your boundaries, have your base year, and also set your targets as well. And it's so important that your targets are science based, so they're in line with that 1.5-degree pathway that I talked about, in line with the Paris Agreement. Check out the Science Based Targets Initiative website if you haven't already. We also do a whole separate uh, session as part of the Supply Chain Sustainability School on setting targets and science based targets and net zero and that sort of thing. So do go check out all the resources on the school on that. The next step is measure. So this is all about measuring your footprint. You can't manage what you don't measure. You need to identify your hotspots and know what you need to prioritize. A lot of companies, especially if they're in the first stages of this, they will do some great quick wins. Maybe they'll switch out their light bulbs to LEDs. But actually, before you get to that stage of actions, you need to actually measure, and you need to make sure that you're being as efficient with your time and resources as possible, because you might put all of your energy into light bulbs, but then once you've done your measurement, you realize that's not where you can have the biggest impact on your carbon footprint or where you can make the biggest cost savings. And this is something that we very much help clients with all the time at Action Sustainability. We help clients kind of gather all of their data and we convert it into a carbon footprint for them. And I'll come back to that in a bit later. And then it's about reducing. So implementing your reduction actions, putting together an action plan as well, and using, the carbon hierarchy and kind of measuring your reductions as you go as well. And then only once you've done those things can you look at carbon offsetting or removals as well. And then, of course, a key part of all of this is reporting. So disclosing your emission and reduction actions and following up, following that kind of continual improvement cycle as well. Always kind of revising and reviewing, and being open to kind of changing things as you go as well. Okay, so to get us thinking about carbon footprinting, on the chat, what do you think is better for carbon, traveling by train or plane for the same distance? What do you think is better in terms of carbon, traveling by train or plane for the same distance? Okay, a few people have said train, train. Okay, most of us are saying train. It might seem a bit obvious, yeah. Although Tom did say it depends. Maybe it does depend, who knows? Okay, so next question on Menti. We've got a bit of a quiz coming up. This next question is timed. Um, okay, we can see we've got a few players ready. I'll start it and then some of you can join. How much do you think it's better for carbon percentage-wise traveling by train versus plane for the same distance? Is it 80%, 60%, 40%, or 20%? Okay, well done to those three that got it right. It is, in fact, 80%, as we can see here looking at this example. This is comparing travelling from roughly Oxford to Glasgow by train and then plane. You can see that it's 22 kilograms of CO2e by train and it's 132 by plane. So that's an 80% difference. Okay, next question on the chat. What is better for carbon, using a plastic or a cotton bag for the same volume? What's better for carbon on the chat, using a plastic or a cotton bag for the same volume? Someone say cotton, cotton, cotton bag. Oh, someone said plastic. Okay, but I think most of us have said cotton. So unsurprisingly, back onto Menti. We've got a follow-up question to that. I'll wait for you all to get ready. Oh, we've had a few more people. Great. Anyone else want to join? Right, I'll get started. But a follow-up question is, how often, though, do you need to use a cotton bag for it to be a lower footprint than a plastic bag? Do you need to use it 320 times, 130 times, 60 times, or 20 times? Oh, mixed responses there, but well done to the five of you that said 130. That is, in fact, right. And as you can see here, you have to use it 173 times if the plastic bag is used as a bin liner and 320 times if the cotton bag is washed. So these questions are just to show actually what appears obvious isn't always correct. And that's why this measurement piece is so important, because we need to actually know what we're dealing with and have the data to back up what we're saying and where we're directing our efforts. So, what is carbon footprinting? Well, a definition is that it's used to describe the total amount of CO2 and other greenhouse gas emissions attributable to an organization, project, or a product. And we can take ourselves through this carbon footprinting cycle. So, it's very similar to that carbon production and process I went through. But essentially, you need to agree your boundaries, gather your data, undertake a footprint analysis. You then, of course, need to identify your hotspots, develop that all important action plan. Of course, then you need to implement those actions, and then you can review progress and report and update your strategy. Everything that I'm going to be talking about in the next few slides to do with carbon footprinting is taken from the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. This is a publicly available document, and this is the foundation for all carbon accounting and reporting. So if you're ever unsure, definitely go and have a look at the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. It has all of the information you need in there about how to calculate and report your carbon emissions. And part of what is in there is what's called the scopes of emissions. And some of you might have heard this term, some of you might already know what the scopes of emissions are, but essentially, this is a way of organizing emissions from a corporate perspective. So it's saying, actually, how do we structure our carbon footprint from an organizational perspective? How do we make sure that we're counting for the right things? And how do we also make sure that we're not double counting? When we're talking about carbon footprinting, it's a little bit confusing because, of course, we're saying carbon, but actually, it's important to bear in mind that we are taking into account all of those six greenhouse gases. But what we do is we put carbon footprints into a carbon dioxide equivalent. So that's what that CO2e means at the end of a carbon footprint. And that just means we're taking into account all greenhouse gases and putting it into an equivalent. Because as you can imagine, it would be pretty complicated calculated if we had a different figure for each greenhouse gas that we had to compare on a yearly basis. So I'm going to quickly take you through these three scopes of emissions because I think it's really useful base knowledge for everyone to have when it comes to carbon accounting. But again, on the Supply Chain Sustainability School, we have loads of resources on this. We have a carbon footprinting e-learning, for example, if you want to find out more. Um, and also, this is what we at Action Sustainability help our clients with, is actually calculating all of their whole carbon footprint across all three scopes of emissions. So let's have a look at what we mean by these three scopes of emissions. So scope one are direct emissions. These are emissions relating to your owned company facilities and owned company vehicles. So this would be any gas that you burn on site, and these would be any fuel that you use in owned vehicles if you have a fleet of vehicles, for example. Scope 2, that grey arrow there, this is electricity. The easiest way to remember scope 2 is electricity. And these are direct emissions because they're released elsewhere and then transported to where you then use them. So indirect emissions, scope 2. And then scope 3 is essentially everything else across the whole supply chain, your upstream and your downstream emissions. And scope 3 consists of 15 different categories. So upstream categories are things like purchase goods and services, waste, business travel, employee commuting. Downstream is things like use of sold products, maybe lease assets, franchises, maybe investments as well. And what you do when you go to calculate your scope 3 emissions is you do a kind of scope 3 mapping process. So you'd assess which categories are relevant to you and which ones aren't, because of course it can seem quite overwhelming when you first look at those 15 categories, but don't worry, because not all of them will apply to your organization. So you'll work out which ones do apply, which ones are relevant to you, and then you'll go about gathering the data within these categories so that you can start to piece together your overall carbon footprinting, including all three scopes. It's worth saying that maybe unsurprisingly, once companies have calculated all three scopes, normally scope 3 accounts for as much as 80 to 90% of their overall carbon footprint. And actually, within scope 3, normally category 1 purchase goods and services accounts for at least kind of 60 to 70% of scope 3 emissions as well. That is normally the biggest proportion of scope 3 purchase goods and services. And of course, that means a lot of kind of liaising, collaborating, engaging with your suppliers in order to get that data from them to be able to piece together your scope 3 emissions. And that's also why carbon in procurement is being talked about so much more at the moment. It's quite a hot topic in the space, because in order to get our carbon emissions down within category 1 purchase goods and services, we need to think about our procurement processes and how we're building in carbon reduction into those processes. And at Action Sustainability, we have a whole sustainable procurement team who are experts in this field and help our clients all the time and make sure that they're being as sustainable as they possibly can with their procurement processes. And I think this diagram really helps also explain how the three scopes of emissions kind of link together. So as I said, if you're tier 1, you'll need to be liaising with your tier 2s to get their scope 1 and 2 emissions, which will combine to create your scope 3 emissions. So you can see how all of the kind of tiers across the whole supply chain link together here with regards to scopes of emissions. And you can see how this fits in with this diagram that I showed initially. So this will all be a process with carbon footprinting. You're not going to have your full carbon footprint across all three scopes in the first instance. You're going to build it up, and most companies start with their scope 1 emissions. It's normally fairly easy to get the data for this. You have direct access to that data, the gas that you burn, fuel that you use. So start with scope 1. You then might want to add in scope 2. Again, electricity, normally pretty easy to get this data from your electricity supplier, bills, that sort of thing. Then maybe you can build in business travel, employee commuting. Again, normally you would have This data through expenses, through employee travel, staff travel forms, that sort of thing, however you gather that data. And then you can start building in more to categories. So then you can build in waste. Again, do you have a waste provider that you can get data from? Then you can start building in purchase goods and services, any water that you use, that sort of thing. So it's very much a process, a step-by-step process. And you might be thinking, okay, where does this data come from? Well, for scope one, we'll be looking at, fuels that we use in gas, plant, and vehicles, any fugitive emissions. Scope two would be electricity. Scope three would be staff, business travel, materials and products, maybe third party logistics. And the kinds of data that we'll be looking for are things like litres of fuel, litres of refrigerant, kilowatt hours of electricity, maybe mileage traveled as well when we're looking at business travel, that sort of thing. And maybe also tons of materials. And then in terms of where the data is, just thinking about the kind of teams and the people that you'd need to liaise with to get this data. It might be your fleet team, it might be estates, maybe HR, maybe they're the ones that have access to the staff expense forms when they're doing business travel, procurement maybe as well, and of course suppliers. And in an ideal world, we want to always be aiming for real data. We want our data to be as accurate and robust as possible, but that just isn't always realistic, especially with time, resource constraints. We might have to use proxy data in some instances or even sample data. And we had to do this at Action Sustainability to understand the impact of our in-person supplier days. It would be too consuming to do this for every day, so we scaled up per month. So that's definitely something that you can do, and then you can work towards making your data more accurate as the years go on. So you might be thinking, okay, but how do I get from gathering that data to then having a carbon footprint? Well, this is how you do it. It's a very simple calculation. You take your activity data, you multiply it by something we call an emission factor, and then that will give you your carbon emission. So an example of this would be, okay, let's say that you've worked out you've used 250 litres of diesel in the last reporting year. You then multiply that by the relevant emission factor, which in this case is 2.758, and that will give you the carbon footprint, which in this case is 689.5. And you can see there that it's kilograms of CO2e carbon dioxide equivalent, which, as I said before, just means we're taking into account all of the greenhouse gases and putting it into an equivalent. And of course, when you're doing these calculations, it's so important to think about units of measurement and converting between them and factors and that sort of thing. You might also be thinking, great, but where do I get those emission factors from? Which is a great question. Most emission factors can be found on the DEFRA website, so the government website. It's publicly available, free to download. They're updated on a yearly basis. You just basically download this big spreadsheet where you can get all of the emission factors from, and you just find the relevant activity data and then the corresponding emission factor. For materials, you might need to use other databases. Bath ICE is another one that you can use for specific materials, but DEFRA is a great place to start. And then just looking at some of these emission factors, so how this differs between different things. So you can see, a kilowatt hour of electricity compared to diesel. There's quite a big difference there. We've looked at the transport example already, but you can see traveling the same distance by train, car, and plane is quite significant, once we're using the relevant emission factor. Materials can differ hugely as well. So 1 ton of aggregate is very different to 1 ton of steel. We're going from 5 kilograms to 1,550 kilograms. And of course, this varies greatly depending on the raw material source, any recycled content that might have been used, any other additives as well, or the manufacturing energy source, and also how this has all been transported, any shipping, transport. To get more kind of detailed information about carbon from a material or a product perspective, we can use something called EPDs, Environmental Product Declarations. And there's more information on the Supply Chain Sustainability School all about EPDs if you want to find out more. But it basically just gives you a real life cycle analysis of a product and where the carbon hotspots are throughout a product's whole life cycle. Okay, we're coming into the last few slides here, so well done for sticking with me. I appreciate I've been through a lot of information and been talking for a while, but I just want to finalize by talking a little bit about carbon equivalency, because I think when we're using these numbers or talking about carbon footprints, if we're not working in the industry or using these numbers a lot, often it just doesn't mean much to us. You know, if I was going to say 33,000 tons of CO2e, do we really know what that means? So sometimes it can help to put it in context. So 33,000 tons of CO2e is the same as 1,000 HGVs, each driving 24,000 miles, or it's the same as 40 flights from London to New York. For me, it's often the flights that really helps bring it to life. I don't know why, but it's also the same as the electricity and gas used in 10,000 UK homes for a year. And that's roughly the size of these towns: Aberdare, Pontypridd, Winsford, or Beverley. Sorry if anyone's Welsh and I just messed up that pronunciation, but maybe that will help kind of bring it to life and help it hit home a little bit for some of you when we're looking at those figures. And whenever you're communicating your own carbon footprint, I'd always recommend that you compare in this way when you're communicating it to your stakeholders, just to make it really clear what you mean by that. And also, just to wrap up with some carbon reduction actions you can take at home. Of course, we've spoken mostly from a business organizational perspective, but actually there's a whole host of things we can do as individuals, and of course you'll have these slides afterwards so you can refer back to them. I'd also really recommend that you calculate your own personal carbon footprint if you haven't before. The WWF website is great for this. You just answer a quick questionnaire and then it breaks down where your emissions are from within each category, basically these categories: so home, diet, travel, and kind of shopping consumption habits. So, you know, a lot of these cross over from workplace solutions as well. You know, it's obvious things such as being energy efficient, diet as well. You know, where can we eat more locally? So food that's more local, hasn't had to travel as far. Also eating less kind of intensive foods when it comes to meat and dairy. Food waste as well. We throw away a lot of bread and potatoes in the UK. If you look at the stats, it's quite alarming. So how can we reduce food waste and just use up every little bit of food? Travel, you know, of course, public transport is always better for carbon emissions. Of course, there are limitations when it comes to price potentially with this, but how can we just be wise when we're making those decisions? And then similarly at the shops, you know, how can we uh, make sure that the things we buy last as long as possible, and actually question, you know, whether we actually need all the things that we do have, if we need to buy more things. And you know, where can we support good companies that are bearing in mind, you know, the people that make the things that they're selling and that sort of thing, and where can we avoid unnecessary packaging and recycling as much as possible. I appreciate there's a lot on there, so you can always refer back to that in your own time. Okay, great. So that's kind of the end of my slides, or my kind of plan content. But do feel free to use the chat if you have any questions at this point. And we'll be sending around kind of contact details as well. I think Keegan has. Oh yeah, great. We've just put on the chat a link as well if you need any more carbon and climate support, or if you just want to get in touch with Action Sustainability, ask us any questions. You know, we're doing this on a daily basis with clients. It's really our bread and butter. So if you do have any questions, please do feel free to get in touch or book a call with me. Great. Thank you so much, everybody. I don't think there's any burning questions, so I'll probably leave it there and let you get on with your days. But thank you so much for joining. And yeah, hopefully see you on another Action Sustainability webinar and session soon. Thanks, everyone. Bye. Thanks. Bye.